If he wasn't going to believe that I was a victim of domestic violence, there was no way he was going to believe that I was going to be a victim of sexual assault.
I met the honey badgers, women who are men's rights advocates.
And then there was a 15-year-old boy, there was a 35-year-old woman, and then later on she came out of jail and she was able to collect child support from this boy that she raped.
Yeah.
After getting out of jail. So there's lack of fairness for men in the court systems. When police officers would show up to domestic violence case, there was often men were just taken away without asking what even happened. It's just presumed that men are the criminals.
I was assaulted several times, and I never got any help. I went to the police still bleeding a couple of times. And one police officer said, I'll never forget this. He said, if she starts hitting you again, you better get out of there fast, because if she just breaks a fingernail trying to hit you, we'll arrest you.
I mean, I can't tell you at this point how many guys I've talked to who are like, yeah, she stabbed me and they put me in jail. Not only are there endless studies that show women are just as violent as men are, when I would talk about it, invariably men would start coming out of the woodwork with stories. Stories they were afraid to tell, stories that they got laughed at for, stories that they got blamed for. It's hideous.
This is not flattering to men, to talk about men's vulnerabilities.
No.
To talk about the ways that they are not strong, and that they are, weak. And to be honest about it, it's not flattering. A solution for both genders is that we need to be able to recognize how men are vulnerable, and we need to be able to recognize how women are actors. Because we have a huge blind spot, especially when women do bad things.
My best friend that I grew up with since kindergarten was being physically abused by his wife, who he'd been married to for 20 years. She'll break glass and throw it at him, punch him. I've seen it just happen spontaneously, and it was frequent. And he's bigger than her, but he didn't want to hit her. And he didn't want the children, they had 3 minor children, he didn't want them seeing this at all. So he would usually just go outside, because there would be glass breaking or things being smashed or yelling, and he knew that the neighbors might think it's him. So he would go outside so the neighbors can see what's happening. Eventually I said, look, you need professional help, and so does she, and maybe the kids do too. So I called a bunch of domestic violence shelters. I just looked around online and I called, but every place that I called said, we don't help men. We don't help male men at all. And I started becoming curious about why that was, because I learned that these were state-funded shelters. And I know that men pay at least half of the taxes that fund these shelters if they're state-funded, and I just was wondering why. So basically, there was no place to take him, and it just continued. The problem just kept going.
In the United States, there are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters. All of them serve female victims, and nearly all of them turn away male victims. In fact, as of 2016, there's only a single domestic violence shelter for men. My initial reaction was that there needed to be thousands more women's shelters because that many more women are being battered. But as it turns out, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. Sure, there's a slight majority of female victims, but how can that excuse denying men help? Couldn't this be considered gender discrimination? Think of it this way. Roughly 78% of all suicides are men, If suicide prevention services only served men, wouldn't we see the gender discrimination immediately? If there are over 2,000 women's shelters that turn away men, and only one shelter for men, obviously the resources don't match the need.
How are you involved in the men's rights movement?
Well, from the very beginning, when I first opened the Refuge, which was in 1971 in Chiswick in London, almost as soon as I took the women in, I got a house for men.
A Voice for Men's editor-at-large, Erin Pizzey, founded the first ever women's shelter in 1971, and she is widely revered in the men's rights community.
Because you see, what I knew from the beginning, most domestic violence is consensual. Both are involved. Sometimes one's the perpetrator, the other plays the victim, then it crosses over. It's not as though it's just all men or all women. It's both. And occasionally innocent victims. Very innocent.
Battered children grow up to batter, that's what I learned. Whether it be a man or a woman. And I now know that if a woman comes in with a history of violence in her own childhood, chances are she will be probably violent to her children, and she will want to live on this knife edge of crisis and danger.
I haven't been allowed to speak. That's the difficulty.
Why is that?
Because I'm completely barred from all conferences. I'm not allowed to walk up the step of my own refuge. I bought the bloody building. But no, because there's feminists. The woman who runs it is a very heavy feminist. She won't have anything to do with me.
What did you say that made them hate you?
That women could be equally as violent as men. That was from the beginning.
Erin Pizzey says that 62 of the first 100 women to enter her refuge were just as violent as the men they left, and violent towards their children.
But there's levels of violence, isn't there? I do not affect that I'm violent.
Well, I'm violent.
So much.
You know, I'm very violent. Well, verbally, and I could quite easily hit somebody. You know, very, very easily. And I've had an argument.
But the feminists I've met have an entirely different take on domestic violence.
On the whole issue of domestic violence, that's just another word, really. It's a cleanup word about wife beating, because that's really what it is, or dating violence. And it's not girls that are beating up on boys. It's boys that are beating up on girls and using violence to intimidate and to control. And we have very few what's called domestic violence shelters, which are places that women can leave their home with their children and get a new start, get out of the violence. But there are not nearly enough of them. We need more funding and more resources, because it is a tremendous disadvantage for women and girls.
In 2014, the CDC released a report revealing that over 5.4 million men and 4.7 million women had been victims of intimate partner physical violence within the previous 12 months. But then why does the media paint domestic violence as a women's issue?
The World Health Organization says 1 in 3 women are abused by their partner.
1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life.
And when it was addressed as a men's issue, the speaker's point was that it's a men's issue because men are the problem.
I'm going to share with you a paradigm-shifting perspective on the issues of gender violence. I don't see these as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues. Why is domestic violence still a big problem in the United States and all over the world? What's going on? Why do so many men abuse physically, emotionally, and verbally and other ways the women and girls and the men and boys that they claim to love? What's going on with men?
Let's grant every single empirical case as being true. Yes, it is true. Let's just say, it is not true, but let's just assume that there is gender symmetry in domestic violence, that women hit men as much as men hit women. If I were to say that, I would say, and therefore we need boatloads more funding for domestic violence, to develop shelters and adequate interventions, because there's this hidden epidemic of men who are being beaten up by women. Or I could say, as the men's rights movement do, therefore we shouldn't have these shelters and we shouldn't fund them because the women are all lying. Well, it seems to me that if you really believe in gender symmetry, it's not that you want to, you're not questioning the number of women. You're just saying the number of men is high. You would want to join with women who are anti-violence to say, we have a real problem here. You know, it's not even a gender problem. It's a problem of women hitting men and men hitting women. We've got to get boatloads more funding. Let's work together. That seems the logical response to this. But instead they're saying it's like a zero-sum game. If we fund the women, then we're going to ignore the men. Well, we're not going to ignore the women because we all agree that the levels are as high as we say.
But it does sound like a zero-sum game when only women are receiving services in domestic violence situations. And of all the men's rights activists I've met, none of them question the number of female victims, but they are calling attention to the high number of male victims that are being dismissed. So why aren't men's rights activists and feminists working together? Michael Kimmel briefly said something that made me wonder. He said it would no longer be a gender problem if both men and women were equally victims of domestic violence. Is that why the number of male victims are never addressed?
To me, it's been fraud for all these years. Why is it we have this enormously powerful feminist movement and virtually nothing for men? Originally, it was capitalism was the big enemy in the 60s and 70s. And it was the radical feminists in America. They moved the goalposts. They said, no, it's no longer capitalism is the enemy. The enemy is patriarchy. All men. And that's how the women's movement began. And it was enormously successful. The new mood in the refuges was going to be that no men could work in refuges and can't today. They can't sit on the boards. And boys over 9 or possibly 12 can't go into refuges, or you call them shelters. Their mothers have to make other arrangements for them, which I find shocking. And it ring-fenced money. I think that particular time when the feminist movement were desperate for funding because they'd run out of publicity, and they were desperate for funding, and they needed a just cause. And unfortunately, it fell into their laps. It's an enormous industry. I mean, violence against women, they get something like, $1 billion and over a year. And an awful lot of that goes on really supposedly rehabilitating men, but essentially punishing them with something that's called the Duluth model.
Duluth Power and Control Wheel. You guys know about that?
No.
I'll give you a copy. In 1977, I think, a bunch of crazy women up in Duluth, Minnesota figured out they had the solution to domestic violence, and it was all about patriarchy and all about men. And it's the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. Because men are all about power and control. Of course, not you ladies. You guys, you don't control anything. You have no power. You're just sweet and innocent little things. Okay. So this power and control wheel is divided up in all these things, you know, about who does this and who does that and blah, blah, blah. Of course, it's all men. The entire domestic violence industry was founded on that. I think it's still 37 or 32 states in the United States that by law they have to use the Duluth model for better intervention programs, and it's all shame, blame, and guilt driven. If you're a man and you walk in, you must admit you did it up front or you're in denial. There's no debate. There's no discussion. There's no possibility that you could be falsely accused. The criminal justice system could have made a mistake. None whatsoever. You are in a state of denial, and you will complete that course or you're going to go to jail. You will be re-engineered.
That's frightening.
Frightening?
Yes, that's frightening.
I think it's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
All I had to do, I had a simple choice. I could just say, yes, you're right. Men are the enemy. No problem. But I couldn't. I absolutely couldn't.
Just getting overwhelmed. Because I don't know where I'm headed with what I believe and what is right and what is wrong and who is wrong and who is right, and the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that's why I'm feeling frustrated, because I don't know where the truth is, and I don't know
When I decided to make a film on the men's rights movement, I never anticipated questioning my feminist views. But the more MRAs I met, the more I felt compelled to remind myself why I was a feminist. I signed up for a women's group.
Welcome to our Women on Your Power workshop. Only 4% of the Fortune 500 companies are led by women. Women only hold about 14% of corporate executive positions and less than 20% of our governmental positions.
I made video diaries complaining about how I had to change what I wore to walk alone at night, how much time it took me to get ready for work, all the housekeeping that was on my shoulders. In comparison to other gender issues, these videos seem trivial, but I made them nonetheless. I attended women's rights rallies.
No to violence. That's what we are here for, to say no more to violence in any form, especially against women and girls.
I repeated women's issues in my head like a broken record. Female genital mutilation, sex trafficking, reproductive rights, maternity leave. And social media helped remind me of women's issues.
We have fought for everybody else's equal rights. It's our time to have wage equality once and for all, and equal rights for women in the United States of America.
We are struggling for a uniting word, but the good news is that we have a uniting movement. It is called He for She.
Whenever I hear the MRA's point of view about how difficult it is for them, I immediately go to, well, what about us? What is it like for us? And then I get on the defensive and want to make sure that women's struggles are also heard. And I don't know if that's necessary, because the MRAs are saying that the feminist perspective is the mainstream perspective. But even when I hear their issues, I still want to speak up for the women, because I feel like, I don't know why I feel like talking about one gender's issues now neglects the other. And I guess that's what MRAs have been dealing with, is always hearing about women's issues and feeling like their issues are neglected. But whenever I hear them talk about men's issues, I feel like I need to stand up for women and say, this is what we're dealing with, an equal opposite. I met with men's rights activist Karen Strawn late one night in a noisy bar. She became well known for her YouTube videos talking about male disposability and other men's rights issues. And she's a honey badger.
Part of what I do and what I research and what I think about is the reasons psychologically